What's going on, Johnny Nation? Welcome to episode 85 of the Eye of the Storm podcast. My name is David Barov, and I'm excited to welcome on another head coach to the pod. He's got 176 wins on his resume and was the man patrolling the sidelines at Manhattan, New Mexico, and your St. John's Red Storm. He's the man that knows all about the Euro ballers in the NBA draft, and you can see him calling games on ESPN. He's got a unique perspective to discuss the happenings with St. John's past and present, including the current Rick Pitino era that is off to a tremendous start. We'll get to it all. I'm excited to welcome to the show, Coach Fran Fraschilla.
David, it's a pleasure being on, and man, time goes fast. It seems like yesterday they were naming me the head coach at St. John's. Some 37-year-old. I can't remember what I was then, but it goes fast. And all's good. Excited to talk to you.
Brad, I spoke to your former guard at St. John's, the great Tariq Turner, the other day about you. He said, quote, "I learned more from him than any other coach I have ever played for." Yeah. He said you were a basketball genius even at a young age at 37 when you got the St. John's job, and you were ahead of your time. And it was easy to see right away. He said he didn't know anything about scouting opponents or anything like that until you showed up, and likened some of your teachings actually to that of a style of Rick Pitino. Looking back on it now, what do you think made you understand the game at that level as a young coach, and how would you encapsulate your time at St. John's?
Oh man, this is going to take 45 minutes. But no,
you got time.
No. First of all, you got to understand, I grew up a basketball junkie in Brooklyn. I grew up going to Carnesecca Arena. We called it Alumni Hall then, Madison Square Garden. All I ever wanted to do was be a college basketball coach, not ever thinking in my wildest dreams that I would end up coaching St. John's for 2 years. You know, it was brief, obviously, but I got a chance to coach around the country as an assistant. I was with Gary Williams, Rick Barnes, Danny Nee, another Brooklyn guy, great, very successful coach. I go to Manhattan College from Providence. I replaced Steve Lapis, who left me a good team, Dave. He really did. We had success there for 4 years. I loved it there. It was a mom and pop store, and then I got a chance to coach at St. John's. I was a young coach, still naive about the big time. Obviously, my tenure ended quickly. And we can get into that. Have no problem with that. Statute of limitations is up, I think. But they paid me all the money they owed me. I went off to TV after a brief stint at New Mexico, and I really thought I was going back to coaching. And once I got to ESPN, I just felt a comfort level with what I was doing. I don't know about the genius part. I was very tough on those St. John's guys. Tariq and I did not talk for a while. I don't know if he shared that with you, but we had to patch some things up because I was very demanding. And I remember seeing Zendon Hamilton. I just talked to Z a couple weeks ago, and I said to myself, whenever I see Zendon, and I saw him at NBA Summer League like 10 or 12 years after I got done coaching him, I said, man, I owe this guy an apology because I was really tough on him. Keep in mind, when I came to St. John's, Zendon and Felipe and Tariq were the celebrated recruiting class, and it just didn't happen for him. You know, Coach Mahoney was a great guy. It just didn't work, for whatever reason. And when I came to St. John's, I was determined to get the thing going and get it back on track because of what Coach Carnesecca had done. By the way, Brian Mahoney's one of the greatest guys of all time. I don't know if you know Coach Mahoney, but we had always stayed friends, and we saw each other at Zendon's wedding a couple of years ago. But when I got to St. John's, I felt like I was on a mission. Young coach, unproven, except at Manhattan. They took a chance on me. They couldn't get Calipari. Honestly, they couldn't get Rick Majerus. And they were really stuck with me, is really how it seemed, because I don't think the administration was their first choice. Anyway, but I want to finish this Zendon story. I see him after he retires, and I wanted to apologize to him, because I thought I was hard on him. And he said, Coach, stop. You're the reason I drive a Range Rover. And when he got married a couple of years ago, he said, where's Coach Fran? And I was in the back of this big room, typical Italian African-American wedding on Long Island, and knew a lot of the people there. And he said, that man in the back, Fran, I made 4 NBA teams because of him. And I think what he was saying was he was tough on us, but he was tough on us with a purpose. And the biggest regret I have, to round it all up, and then you ask me a million questions, is I wish I had a better relationship with Father Harrington, because when I interviewed at Arizona State, Dick Vitale, Sonny Vaccaro, Calipari, they were all telling me, hey, talk to this guy at Arizona State. You may really like going out there and you may get a raise at St. John's. I knew I wasn't going. When I turned the job down about 5 weeks later, I was called into an office and said I was fired. I think they felt I was disloyal. They used some things that against me that they used in the paper, but my players and people around the program know that was really kind of nonsense. Be that as it may, it was unfortunate because of the communication gap. Because I honestly believe we would have had incredible success over the next period of time, however long I had stayed.
It's interesting. When I first reached out to you, in my mind, I have this idea, this voice from the fan base where they hold like this odd grudge against you. And I started asking around why.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was like, he put together the team that eventually goes to the Elite Eight, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But the sense that I got and some of the things that people started to tell me is like, man, we felt like Fran turned his back on us, on the fans, that he was building something, and we thought he was going to be like the next Carnesecca. And I find that that's an interesting point of view. And I guess in one sense, the fans thought, here's this young coach, he's about to turn it around. He has success almost immediately in year 2 of his tenure. And then all of a sudden it kind of all fizzles away of what could have been, especially then seeing that group of players that you put together actually have that success, and probably went through the vision and that you ultimately had when putting together that team.
Well, first of all, I think you got to understand, I don't know where I was on the totem pole in the Big East, but I was probably the lowest paid coach. Probably. I don't know if I was, but coming from Manhattan College, I think I made $80,000 at Manhattan, at that time. And so I get the St. John's job, grateful. I loved Ed Mineta. We still have a good relationship when I see him at Barclays. I don't think Ed had a lot to do with my firing. I wasn't going to take the Arizona State job. The athletic director there, Kevin White, later went on to Notre Dame and then Duke and became a powerful guy. But it's funny, Dickie V kept saying, you got to talk to him. I was hoping to get a raise out of it, honestly. And I always say this, Alex Evans, who was my consigliere, he was our director of operations. He used to tell me, like, Coach, we're spending a lot of money on tickets for these recruits. And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, you got 8th graders coming to these games. Like, we had kids coming to Madison Square Garden that later played in the NBA. If people knew who we were recruiting, I'll give you an example. My good friend Barry Rorson, who I grew up with in Brooklyn, and I used to kick his butt on the playground, although he was good friends with Chris Mullen, and I didn't kick Chris's butt. Chris was 4 years younger than me, and so was Barry. But when Barry went to Pittsburgh, if you look at the success Ben Howland had at Pittsburgh, he did it with all St. John's guys. I mean, we were recruiting kids like Levance Fields and, Talik Brown. They ended up taking Omar, which worked out fine for a year or two, but I was recruiting Talik Brown in 8th grade out of St. John's Prep. Ben Gordon.
How about that full circle moment? Talik on staff now.
Well, it's crazy because I always felt no knock against Omar. Omar had an amazing 20-year career in Europe. But I thought at that time in 8th, 9th grade that Talik Brown was St. John's. He was Mark Jackson. He was I don't know. They all turned out great. Andre Barrett, Talik, and Omar. But my point is, Dave, we were recruiting 8th, 9th, 10th graders. We had it rolling behind the scenes. And I wish I would have been able to tell Father Harrington, Father, hey, I was only interviewing to get a raise. Okay. I wasn't interviewing at Arizona State to leave. I was just doing what everybody does when you have a good year, especially since I was underpaid. And I had it in my contract that I could interview. It wasn't like I broke any rules. My athletic director gave me permission. So again, communication issue. Had I discussed this, and by the way, I didn't get to know Father Harrington much because in the 2 years I was there, even though I did 70 speaking engagements with St. John's away from basketball, in and around basketball, but fundraising and whatnot, Father Harrington was off to Hong Kong with the Hong Kong campus, Rome with the Rome campus. I rarely saw him and got to know him, like I did the people in the athletic department. So I have no regrets because I think everything happened for a reason. The one thing I do regret is that had there been better communication, um, who knows what could have happened. I could have been coaching the Knicks after 10 years at St. John's, because we really had a foundation built behind the scenes that it was just unimaginable how many good young New York kids we were recruiting. All those kids that went to UConn and went to Pitt, they would have had a hard time leaving New York City because of the way we recruited those guys.
So you had a monster class, right?
Yes.
You talk about these the recruits, everything behind the scenes. So let me ask you something. You tried to recruit Lamar Odom before he chose Rhode Island. Odom is
Yes
part
and
of the
no. Yes and
legendary
no.
Riverside Hawks team. He's the
Yeah.
one piece of that team that kind of got away. You got Chudney Gray, Eric Barkley, Ron Artest, Reggie Jesse, and my good friend Anthony Glover, who wanted me to tell you hello.
Awesome.
So listen,
You have it backwards.
Elton Brand is that one piece though that
Yes.
you say, okay, fine, he goes to Duke, you can't compete with Duke. Lamar
Yeah.
Odom is like, how do we let that guy get to Rhode Island?
Oh no, you miss it. You miss it. See, this is good stuff. The year before, we had a choice: Lamar or Ron. It was going to be one or the other. Those two guys were friends, but they were not going to school together. And Ron Artest, when I saw him play as a 16-year-old, when I was coaching in Manhattan, see, the beauty of being at Manhattan College is I would recruit the fourth best guy on the Gauchos and Riverside. So Ernie Lorch and Lou Dalmeda, they loved me because I was looking out for their third, fourth, fifth best players.
Right.
And they had this incredible rivalry, but I was kind of like Switzerland, I was neutral. When I went to St. John's, I had such a great relationship with both of them that we could recruit both programs. And so, first of all, it was Lamar or Ron Artest. And I love Lamar. I haven't seen him in a while, but we'd see each other through the years after he went on to the pro career. Ron Artest epitomized the toughness of St. John's. He epitomized what I wanted. Okay. And he also played for Riverside. Remember, Lamar played for Gary Charles, Long Island Panthers, who later became a dear friend and still is. But so we had that choice. So we chose Ron, and Ron ended up coming, and that's a story in itself because it went down to the wire with Leonard Hamilton at Miami. Okay. And Leonard, trust me, was in Queensbridge more than I was. Okay. So we got him. And then the next year, Riverside, you mentioned it, like Reggie Jesse, it was Reggie and Ron, and then Anthony Glover, Barkley. And I visited Elton Brand and Peekskill with his mom. What you had to do at St. John's at that time, and I'm sure Coach Pitino is doing it now, you had to decide, Dave, which kids were staying home and which kids were leaving. Not every kid wants to stay home and not every kid wants to leave.
Sure.
And we visited with Elton, but in my heart, I knew he was leaving. He was leaving town. And even today, I see him. We laugh and joke about it, but we knew he was getting away. I was okay with 4 to 5 starters on arguably the greatest AAU team of all time.
Yeah, what are they 69-2 or something like that? 69-1.
Yeah. And by the way, the last guy that I signed and I got fired like 2 weeks later was Anthony. Anthony to me was another guy that epitomized St. John's. And if you knew me, and I think you kind of know my background, Anthony Glover is like Mr. St. John's. Okay. If you
always
look
around the program.
Yeah, because like for every Walter Berry, Chris Mullen, Mark Jackson, the great late Malik Sealy, there's always the Anthony Glover who I call the culture warrior. Willie Glass was like that in the old days. He's the 4-year guy that doesn't necessarily get all the credit, but you don't win without Anthony Glover,
Hard to find guys like that today.
Well, you know what? I got to tell you, when I do games on TV and I think of Kansas and Kentucky and like Duke, like if you think of Emil Jefferson a couple of years ago, Quinn Cook, Kansas has had like Brady Morningstar, these guys that aren't big names. Those guys were 4-year guys that are culture warriors. And St. John's through the years has had a lot of those guys who kind of don't get the recognition of, say, a Mullen or a Walter Berry. So anyway, that gives you a little taste of the recruiting that we were doing. And we had that going on. Bob Semino, the coach at Mount Vernon, he told somebody, he said, I saw 50 Manhattan College practices when I first started coaching because Fran let me come to every one of them. And when I got fired at St. John's, they had a sophomore over there by the name of Ben Gordon at Mount Vernon, and I'm just going to guess and bet. And I like Calhoun, but he knows how I was with him. And we would have went toe to toe on that guy. And I have a fun time thinking he would have left the New York area. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, look at you sending all these guys to UConn, Talik Brown and Ben Gordon.
Well, what about
Let's
hey,
go.
what about Pittsburgh? They built that program around
Sure.
Ronald Ramon and Levance Fields and I almost got Brevin Knight to come to Manhattan College, and his brother Brandon goes to Pittsburgh, and then Chris Taft from Severian.
Mm-hmm.
You think those Severian guys would have gone to Pittsburgh with me and Mullen in my back pocket? Come on.
Brad, you had a team at St. John's, had a core of Felipe Lopez, Tariq Turner, Zendon Hamilton, Ty Grant. By year 2, you add LeVar Postel, who starts to take that sophomore jump. Mentioned Ron Artest. He put together a great season before losing to Detroit in the first round of the tournament. What was that team like? What was it? What was that season like for you? Just to see that amount of talent kind of get to a place that St. John's has not been for 5 years before you got there.
Let's give credit where credit is due, because Brian Mahoney did leave me some talent, some really good talent, and great people. I think anybody who knows Tariq and Tyrone, and obviously Felipe and Zendon are two of the all-time best people. Felipe Lopez to me is the Prince of New York City. With the crap he took when he wasn't doing well to how he ended his career in the NCAA tournament, that guy, the 30 for 30 Dominican dream. But that was a fun year because we thought we were turning the corner, but we started out the Big East, David, 0-3. We lost 2 games in December, and we lost an early January game at the Garden to Seton Hall. We won 12 out of the 13 after that. The only loss was a surprise loss to Notre Dame in the Garden in the middle of that run. But we won at Pittsburgh. We won at Syracuse. We went to some tough places. We won at Seton Hall, Rutgers, Villanova, and it started to click and come together. Keep in mind, I also signed Bootsy Thornton that year, and he joined us in December, and I didn't play him right away because I was thinking long term. Now, if I was looking to leave St. John's to go after greener pastures, I would have played Bootsy Thornton the minute he was eligible. And
so one of the things that Tariq told me the other day, he said, if anybody wants to sit around and try to discredit Fran and his efforts in at St. John's, the man was a master recruiter, because you don't get guys like Bootsy from Baltimore and whatever, and things like that. So the fact that Bootsy was also a part of this class, and when everybody knows what Bootsy did and how impactful he was the year after, and the Duke game. I mean, everybody, Bootsy's synonymous with big shots as well. So I just wanted to point that out too. Tariq had plenty of great things to say.
It's very kind of him. But again, we could have played Bootsy and we saved him because we were looking big picture, right? So that season was really fun because we did get on a roll. And that was when, if you remember, and if you don't remember, I'll remind you, that was the senior year, Felipe started making jump shots and he became the prince of the city. Zendon was rocking and rolling. Tariq he and I struggled as a point guard and a coach. We did, if he's honest, he'll tell you that. And it came to a point where probably midway through his senior year, we started to have this, symbiotic relationship. And again, it took a lot of toughness and demanding, and they were magical. We had the magical game in the semifinal of the Big East tournament where we lost to Syracuse in overtime, and the kid fell down and traveled. And then I think Todd Bergen hit a shot, right? I'm on the court doing this like Louis. And here's the thing you don't know. I lost the Detroit game. It was totally my fault. So we have this magical Big East season, 0-3 to 13-5. Think about that, right? I should have celebrated our team. We had a great run in the Big East tournament. We blow out Boston College and we have this great game against Syracuse. I was almost relieved going home that night. saying, man, I'm so glad I don't have to play UConn tomorrow night. And we're still in the NCAA tournament,
Mm-hmm.
because the magic had started. But that next week before the Detroit game, Dave, I was a complete asshole. I was over the top tough on them. I was screaming and yelling. I made everybody tense. And I should have celebrated what was a great season. I just didn't want them to lose to a team like Detroit. Worst thing I could have done. They had the same tough kids I had at Manhattan. They had the chip on their shoulder. They knew they were playing St. John's, Big East, Felipe Lopez, and we lost that game. And Felipe had the shot to win it. We crawled back in it and we got him a great look. Didn't go down, but I completely lost that game in the week up to it by being over the top tough. Totally. And I've told some of those guys that. And then that season ends. I go recruiting. I'm trying to get Al Harrington. We had some guys coming that later went to other schools. And then, I got fired. I got fired the day before I was taking my two little kids to Disney World. May 8th, May 8th, 1998, by the way. Same day that the Knicks won the world championship in 1970.
All right, I hate to ask this question. I don't even know if you're going to answer it, but it might make some St. John's fans upset. But who were some of those players that were potentially coming to St. John's?
Oh man, we had a kid named Mate Melissa, 6'11" kid, a JUCO kid. We needed one more big guy. We had Zenden leaving and we had some really good pieces. Mate was a kid, and I didn't know a lot about international basketball back then. Obviously, later I became a little
Yeah.
bit of a guru. But we had a kid, he was from Pensacola Junior College. Uh, just like a Jokic type, Jokic before Jokic. And he was coming. Um, he when I got fired, he went to Long Beach State and was like an all conference player out there. Would have been a really good, like 12-8 guy on a really good team with Artest and those guys. I'm trying to think we're still recruiting Al, but Al was going pro. There were a couple other guys, but we were done recruiting for the most part because of the class we brought in. But again, the junior class, Shagari Aline, the 7'3" kid from Rice, he was an 8th grader. He was coming to games. You got to understand the relationship I had with Mo Hicks and Coach Nash at Bishop Ford and Tom Murray at Cardinal Hayes, John Carey, Coach Kerr. Here's a little nugget. Coach Curran and Louis did not get along great. Not a lot of people know this. He didn't come to a lot of St. John's practices until I became the head coach because I had Jason Hoover at Manhattan College. And so, I mean, I had Jack Curran come into practices. I had that relationship build up from my time at Manhattan with the high school coaches and obviously Lou and Ernie with the Gauchos and Riverside. So, hey, it's water under the bridge, but you're getting information that I haven't shared with many people in 25 years.
What could have been. I
And
know a
by the
lot of
way, no bitterness, no bitterness. It's
yeah.
past. I have had a great career. I look back at times thinking what could have been. I've done a couple games at St. John since I left. I have a lot of people there are still my friends. Kathy Meehan just retired.
Yes.
She's been there, so a lot of people that were there. And I think people that were there kind of knew what happened. I just got crossways with Father Harrington.
And that's kind of one of the other reasons why I wanted to do this because, uh, like I said, there's some silly fans that are holding grudges. Like you
I
guys
don't.
need to hear this perspective. You guys need to hear these stories and hopefully change how you feel. But it's also take a trip down memory lane, hear about the what ifs, hear about these stories. I mean, this is invaluable. And this is the stuff that I personally live for. Is the reason why we do this. Is reason why we started this podcast. I mean, I love this.
Yeah,
Fran,
and honestly, no bitterness because things happen for a reason. I was going so hard.
and look, I've had people tell me that, like, I want the fans, honestly, like, yes, you hear it from Fran, but I'm telling you guys, like, I've heard it from the school. I've heard, like, there is none of this nonsense. Please don't believe some of the rumors and stuff out there. Like,
Well,
there
listen,
is
I was
none of
over.
this.
If I tell you like, hey, kiss my butt, if we can, like, kiss my butt, if you think we can play this way and win, did I say stuff like that? Of course, but I wasn't. Let's put it this way. Here's a word that they used. I say they, it was probably, whoever it was, verbally abusive. Okay. I mean, I could pick out spots where Tom Izzo or Bill Self or whoever. I mean, and I think with Tariq and Zenden and Felipe and,
Yeah,
LeVar and guys like that, they knew. But again, you can't relive the past. Things happen.
sure.
I've had an incredible broadcasting career. And honestly, Dave, I could have had a heart attack. I was going so hard. I mean, I was coming home. I was on the road like a lot. I mean, just the recruiting, the speaking, and we were so anxious to get St. John's back. Now, I've told Mike Jarvis this because he never did give me the credit, and I let him know that because what good coaches do is they say, "Hey, we're winning," but like when I got Manhattan College, Steve Lapis I inherited a great team. I went to the tournament my first year at Manhattan, but they were Steve's guys. Now I
Mhm.
coached them up, but like I never heard that from Mike, and I let Mike know about it years later because he never mentioned my name the next year. And that's fine, but that was a hard year for me because I didn't really want those shots to go down in the Elite Eight. That would
So
have been
let's
hard.
talk about that year because
Yeah,
you perfectly segue me into it, man.
there you go, man.
The year after your departure, I mean, all your guys, led by Coach Mike Jarvis, go to the Elite Eight, which
Yeah,
still to this day is the best St. John's has done since Louis was patrolling the sidelines.
yeah,
What was it like watching that? I mean, obviously, you just said you didn't want those shots to go in. All
yeah.
the St. John's fans will disagree with you. But what was it like watching that season, following them that season? I mean, was there a feeling of what could have been with you there? Was there a feeling of I could get them over the hump past that Elite Eight? I mean,
Yeah.
just what was it like for you seeing the guys that you put together in that Red Storm St. John's uniform?
Well, it's a good
Succeed.
question. It was a very tough year because I had two little boys. And while I had a lot of friends in the coaching administration world, like I knew I was going back to coaching. I mean, I had some very powerful athletic directors say, "Hey, we'll take care of you. You're going to be back in coaching next year. We know what happened." Um, which so that part was a relief, but I used the year to catch my breath, watch my kids. I started my broadcasting career that year. I started doing some games for ESPN, Westwood One Radio. But I knew I was going back to coaching, so I looked at it as it was a halftime break in a way. Um, Very tough to watch St. John's, obviously. And I will say this: I've never said this before. I don't. They were rolling, and there was a time during the season. I don't think they hit a lot of bumps that year, but there was a time during the season where one of the guys told me later they were in the locker room without the coaches, and they said, "This is BS. We need to go back and play defense like Coach Fran taught us," which was kind of cool, you know. But I don't know that we could have gotten any better than Mike did. Coach Jarvis in his own way was a very good coach, so kudos to him for doing that year. And so I'm not saying we would have went to the Final Four, but because you never know. You just don't. It's just how the ball bounces. Mike did a very good job with those two teams, I think. Because remember, Marcus Hatton came because of Bootsy. You didn't really have to recruit Marcus because Bootsy was like his big brother in Baltimore.
Marcus is a great friend of the podcast. We've had him
Yeah,
on.
and I mean,
We love Marcus here.
Marcus will tell you, like I knew Baltimore well from recruiting down there, and I knew Bootsy well, even though I never thought I would coach him at Manhattan because he went JUCO. And when I got the St. John's job, his junior college coach called me and said, "Look, and this is what happened. If there's a bunch of people cheating to get him, I don't want him part of that. I want him to play for you." And he actually failed Marcus. Excuse me. Bootsy actually failed a class in the spring of his sophomore year to get out of a national letter of intent because he didn't want to go to the coach didn't want him to go to the school he signed with. I won't even to say the school because the coach ended up being a great friend of mine, and Bootsy was fine with it. And so Bootsy finished his undergrad AA degree in the fall of that next year. We had him visit, and he signed with us, and that's when he started practicing. And
Mhm.
Bootsy is one of the all-time great people. But anyway, so it was a tough year. But I knew I was going back to coaching eventually, and then I ended up at New Mexico out in witness protection, that's what it seemed like. And then I don't say that I have satisfaction with the fact that St. John's went downhill. Norm Roberts was a very good friend. I think he was close to getting it over the top. Steve had that one great season with the kids that
Mhm.
Norm had recruited.
Right.
But there was probably some satisfaction with the idea that I kind of jokingly told people that I put a curse on them, which is obviously not true. But I felt
You remember I told you. Remember I told you about those fans that are holding a grudge, right?
no, no,
Maybe
no.
that Fran Fraschilla curse.
No, I don't think they'd even believe that. But I felt bad in the sense that what could have been, And a couple of years ago, I did a Xavier St. John's game on the radio at Carnesecca Arena, and a couple of boosters like came down to the court and said, Fran, come over. Hey, we really miss you." And I said, this is my snarky side. I said, "You'd have been giving me the ball tonight for my 750th win." But again, I don't look back. I really don't. I'm happy for this current team. I'm a fan of Coach Pitino. Learned a lot of basketball from him. I think he's phenomenal for St. John's and the Big East. He's probably as good for the Big East as he is for St. John's, although St. John's fans are thrilled with him. But the thing he says about complimenting Shaheen Holloway and last night Kim English, he's so good for that league. It's going to elevate that league, I think, even beyond his coaching.
We'll talk about Coach Pitino in a bit. Fran, you just talked about how some people labeled you as, quote, verbally abusive in that second year or towards the end of your
Not
tenure.
some people, basically couple people that
It, so
needed.
in that second year, you say you guide St. John's 22-10, 13-5 in the conference.
Yeah.
And in an article written by George Willis of the New York Post, he characterized your dismissal from St. John's was due to coaching style viewed too demanding for some and had clashed with St. John's hierarchy. Now, coaching styles have changed significantly since then from what is
Yes.
tolerated to the microwave society, as Rick Pitino calls it, with the instant gratification of freshmen and the parents, and especially now with the transfer portal. Do you think the hard-nosed coaching from your time has a place in college basketball today? And in turn, you're going to find that gritty type of kid who can withstand all sorts of adversity and hardships to ultimately reach their potential?
It's a great question. It really is, David. It's a good question. First of all, I never clashed. Let me just say this, because George was a friend. Mark Kriegel wrote the ultimate story about my situation when he called the president of the school, Father Steinbrenner, but that's a whole nother story. I didn't say that. Mark Kriegel did. And I didn't clash with administration because I never had any dealing with them. The only person I dealt with every day was Mr. Mineta, and we had a great relationship. So again, I think a lot of that was just you got to say something when you fire a guy who's been successful, right? But to answer your question, and it's a good one, yes and no. I have two sons coaching, one in college, one in the NBA. They're both completely different than me. They know how to reach guys without getting on them and yelling and screaming. Now, one of them coaches pros. Okay. So you don't coach pros the way, say, a Rick Pitino did, maybe still does a little. And I think here's what I would say. I haven't seen Rick's practices. I know how tough he was for 30 plus years. I'm even thinking that Rick has mellowed. I've seen Kelvin Sampson mellow. I've seen Bill Self mellow. I certainly would have mellowed because the kids have changed a little bit. You could still be tough, demanding, hold them accountable. You absolutely have to let them know you love them. When I look back on my relationship with Felipe Zendon, Tariq, I think they saw 5 and 10 years later that I really did care about them. But I think back then you didn't have to tell them you loved them every single day like you do now. So it's a great question you ask, and I do think my coaching style would have absolutely had to evolve because we all many of us coached hard coaching back then, and now I think you really have to adjust. And the best I see at it, because I'm in the Big 12, is Kelvin Sampson, and I know Coach Pitino is probably this way. I have no doubt in my mind behind closed doors, he's still a tough, demanding, hard-nosed guy, ain't taking crap. But I'm sure even he through the years has mellowed because of the way the kids have changed.
Well, he'll even admit that. And in his post-game press conferences, you see that he's complimenting his guys while also holding them accountable.
Right.
Just yesterday after the win against Providence, in the post-game press conference, Danis Jenkins and Joel Soriano are sitting next to Rick Pitino, and Rick is saying that these guys need to be better. In the next sentence, he's saying that I wouldn't trade Danis Jenkins for any point guard in the country. He says Joel Soriano I wouldn't trade him for any center in the country. But at the same time, he knows how to nudge and push the right buttons and motivate.
Yep.
So I think that, yeah, I think you're 100% right. And Rick would agree. Rick said that in the offseason, Rick said that he's laughing a lot more. They're going about things a little bit differently now than what they did, back in his Providence days when Jeff Van Gundy basically said the NCAA had to institute time limits on practice because of Rick Pitino and what they did with the Friars.
Let me tell you a great story about that. 37 years ago, and I heard this secondhand from all the Providence guys, right? They're playing Georgetown, I think, in the NCAA tournament. It might have been the game, might have been the Elite Eight game. And it might have been that game or the game before Sweet 16. And remember, he and Billy Donovan were like, thick
Yep.
as thieves, right? Two Long Island point guards, and Billy was, lost his 40 pounds, became a great player. And at halftime of one of those games, he said, "You're the worst point guard I've ever coached in my life." And they came back, great run. Billy D was magical like he was. And in the locker room after the game, Rick turned to the team. He said, "I wouldn't trade this guy for any player in America." And then Coach Pitino is among the things that I know he does well and has done well for 40 plus years now is he's not only a great teacher of the game, he's an incredible motivator. And he's going to motivate you the way he thinks is going to best push your buttons. And that's why I said that. When I read his quotes about his team, now from a little bit of a distance, but I'm a media guy, but I'm also a coach. He's a genius. He's always been a genius as a coach, but he's a genius as a guy that can push the right buttons and get the guys to be motivated. I'll tell you a story. Chris Ledwin played for my son Matt, and Chris is a good player, and he's a good kid. He's from my neighborhood, Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. And when he chose to go to St. John's, I said, perfect. Because Chris could get away with things in the Ivy League that he can't get away with Coach Pitino, honestly. And I know he's been injured and that's hurt him a little bit. And hopefully he finishes strong. But it wouldn't surprise me like late in the year if Chris Ledwin becomes like this double guy that you go, damn, early in the year he was so up and down. What's going on? And it's Rick pushing the buttons every day. If Chris gets healthy, I'm confident that he'll be the player that I think he can be because he's very talented.
People know you have the pulse on overseas players. St. John's has a good one coming next year in Lefteris Leotopoulos, a 6'5" guard forward who can really shoot it. Spoke
Yeah.
to a handful of guys who run recruiting services and ranking sites that there's still such a discrepancy in being able to rank the Euro kids amongst the kids in the United States, even though so many more are coming to the United States to play in college. UCLA, Gonzaga, Xavier, and many others are starting to bring them in at
Yep.
multiple at a time. You look at the NBA draft this year, all the projections, the first round is littered with European players. Everybody knows you've got your pulse on the Euro guys. So do you think that with this influx of European players, not only in college, but also in the NBA, do you think scouting services are going to begin to focus more on the Euro market to be able to, appropriately put numbers and stars next to some of these Euro guys as it's becoming far more popular?
Well, I'm going to tell you, you ask great questions. I mean that. I'm saying that to you. That you ask great question. This is another great question. The world has changed. The globe has shrunk. Um, UB Brown, Chuck Daly, Dr. Jack Ramsey, Coach Carnesecca, big time. Bob McKillop, Dean Smith. They went over to Europe in the 60s and 70s and they taught the game around the world, not just Europe, but mainly Europe. They taught the game to the point where those guys are teaching it back to us now. That's how good a job they did. And you see it in the NBA. The globe has shrunk, David. And what's happening now with the kids in Europe, the young kids, 16, 17, 18, they see Jokic, they see the Greek freak. They see all these guys now in the NBA, 25% of the league. And more of these kids are coming over because they used to have to turn pro like baseball minor leagues, right? You sign with the pro team in the major leagues. But in America, you could go to Clemson, you can go to St. John's and play baseball and get drafted. That's becoming more prevalent now where the kids are coming to college because they see the NBA, America, United States, Hollywood, Madison Square Garden, Empire State Building. So yes, the globe shrunk. More kids are coming over. I haven't seen a young man that signed at St. John's because I'm now transitioning to USA Basketball 3-on-3 Olympic stuff. We're going to the Olympics in Paris, and that's something else that I'm doing now. But what I would tell you is, if Rick thinks he's good enough, there's a good chance he's good enough because he spent that couple years in Greece.
Right.
But European kids are hit or miss. They really are when they come to college. They're hit or miss. And so I'm not sure about him. If Rick thinks he's good enough, that's a good sign. And then I also know he's going to get coached he's going to get coached harder at St. John's than any place else. So if he's got talent, and I will say this about European kids, they've been coached hard. So they're not going to run from a challenge. And I'm sure Rick can get in his ass when he gets there, and they're going to be doing like 2-a-days and skill development. And it may not be 4 hours like in the old days, but you never know. It could be. But if he's good enough, he'll get better. He'll get better.
Fran, a little more 11 months ago, you were on a podcast with Barstool and said if Madison Square Garden gets packed again, you'd put it up there with Allen Fieldhouse for
Yeah,
atmosphere in college
yeah,
basketball.
yeah.
Now with Rick Pitino, we saw a little over 14,000 on a Monday night in the building against Michigan. The Garden was buzzing for Providence versus St. John's last night. When you left and
Yeah.
Coach Jarvis took over, St. John's was banging on the doorstep of consistent national relevance, and then it fell apart, unfortunately. They've been looking for the right guy to lead it back to national relevancy for 2 decades. And, in March of 2003, they hired Rick Pitino. When you heard the news that Rick was the next guy to lead the program you once did, what was your reaction?
Genius. I told you earlier, I think before we came on the air, Rick and I are not close friends. We've crossed paths many, many times because of our New York and Providence connections. But I was a guy at 19 years old that watched his first conditioning workouts at Boston U because one of my good friends was his first point guard, Glenn Consor. And I remember sneaking into the gym at Boston U back in September of 78. And he was a madman. He was. He'll tell you that. High level intensity. When he took the job, when they hired him at St. John's, I said, I think, and I don't mean to put pressure on him, and I don't think he cares if I say this, but it's not going to surprise me if they're in the Sweet 16 by next season. If you put Rick Pitino at Alaska Anchorage, he'd be in the Sweet 16 by year 2. We all know that. Anybody who's coached knows that. He's going to find a way to get the right guys to do what he wants, to play the right way. And you're seeing it now, the infancy stage. So it's a brilliant hire. And then you add in the former Knicks coach. He knows New York. He's a New Yorker. He had the success at Iona, kind of his redemption tour. And I think it's phenomenal. And I think he's incredible, not only for St. John's, as I said earlier. I think he's going to raise the level of the Big East. I think I do broadcasting. I broadcast the best league in the country, Big 12. Now, Danny Hurley disagrees with that, my good friend, and we'll get into that in a little while. But
I disagree with that too, but hey, I'm biased too.
But yeah, but no, I think that when you look at what Creighton and Villanova have done recently, and Marquette last year struggling a little, UConn certainly coming back. It has a chance to be right at the top of college basketball. And Rick elevates the Big East in that regard, without a doubt.
And somebody that'll no questionably concur with that is Val Ackerman, the commissioner of the Big East, who was at the press conference for Rick Pitino, and she doesn't really do that for everybody because she knew what it meant that St. John's made such a hire and what they knew that they were looking at for the bigger picture in the Big East to elevate it. I'm tying in a few of the things that we talked about here, but Rick is no stranger to demanding coaching, as you mentioned. I mentioned Jeff Van Gundy said in the past that the NCAA basically implemented those time limits because of practice at Providence. Peyton Siva was on this podcast, and he told me that he hid from Rick Pitino during practice so he wouldn't have to run on the treadmill. When you look at Coach Pitino's career, and the championships obviously speak for themselves, the Final Fours speak for themselves, is his blueprint towards player development and turning over a culture at every stop he's been, is it possible to be replicated here again at St. John's? Because you have a fan base that is beaten down and downtrodden and holding on to this hope that, all right, well, they made the hire that we've all been asking for. And could he possibly turn it around here? There has been so much bad luck here. There has always been that shoe that falls at St. John's. Could this be the hire that everybody thinks turns it around? Now, you just said Sweet 16 by year 2. If that happens, they're building a Rick Pitino statue. But, we've seen him do it everywhere. Literally, you just said he could do it in Alaska. Can he do it in Queens?
Is he doing it so far? That's what I would ask you. Given what he's, given the way they had to rush to put the roster together, think about all the craziness of the spring and summer coming and going, who's staying, who's going. This guy from Oregon State, this guy from Harvard, and that came in the summer because Chris started out, Chris was at Tennessee for a month. Yeah. So the short answer is look at he's done so far, and what he's doing so far is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, recruiting's critical. Getting guys to stay home is going to be critical. And this is not going to set them back that much, but what really hurt St. John's in the last 20 years is the fact that the PSAL has evaporated. talent-wise. Every 13, 14-year-old kid in New York and Jersey now, somebody grabs them and puts them in prep school. And so they don't play at Christ the King as much anymore. They obviously Christ the King's still pretty good in some other schools locally, but it wasn't like the old days in the CHSAA where it was just must-watch TV or must-watch viewing, I guess. The talent level's gone down because these young players now go to prep school early. They get out of New York City because people don't want them to go to the public schools. The Catholic League coaches, the legends, have either retired or passed away. And so what's harder for Rick now than it was for us 25 years ago was, I told you earlier, we figured out who was staying home. We recruited them. Ron Artest at the end of the day was a Queensbridge kid. He wanted to be home. He wanted Madison Square Garden. Same with Anthony and those guys, Reggie Jesse. So what Rick's got to do with his staff, and I think they can do this, is they've got to sell New York City, not just to the few local kids that are left that are good enough, but they got to convince a kid from Chicago or, Virginia that you need to come to New York City, play for a Hall of Fame coach in one of the 2 or 3 best leagues of college basketball in the world's greatest arena. And oh, by the way, he'll help make you an NBA player.
Right.
And that's the selling point. And that's what I think he's going to be able to do. Now, it hasn't happened yet because it's only year 1, but that's the goal for his coaching staff.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the Catholic League, and we look at Joe Arbitello at Christ the King and what he's been able to build over the last 20 years. You look at what Joe Buck is doing at Lou High right now and creating an absolute national powerhouse. You look at Stepanak.
Yes.
Yep. You look at Cardinal Hayes. You look at the infrastructure of New York City basketball is still built around the Catholic League, and somebody who is near and dear to my heart, Ron Niclario with Cardozo, who, what used to be the where a lot of your talent of basketball came from Queens and Brooklyn and at Lincoln and all that. You're not seeing that as much anymore because these kids are being pulled left and right, or whether they're going to Florida to a prep school, they're going to Texas, these places that have become hotbeds for talent. You see how many NBA players are coming out of these states. So I think that's a really good point. But I know that Rick Pitino and Steve Masiello and Van Macon and Talik Brown and Ricky Johns are in these these Catholic League gyms all the time.
But I would say to you, absolutely 100% right. You mentioned some great high school coaches, no question. But 20 years ago, there were 5 times that. You know what I mean? That's the thing. I mean, for every Lou High or CK, or Stepanak, and I lived a mile from Stepanak when I was coaching in New York, there were 5 more of those. Rice High School's closed down. Bishop Ford closed down. Nazareth still is, I think it's still open, but not maybe the power it was. So that's the trick. But, the transfer portal, we didn't have that, right? Now, if you're a kid that's already proven, like, let's just say there's going to be 15 more Joel Sorianos in the next 5 years from the mid-majors that want to play at St. John's. So you got that talent pool that's opened up that we didn't have back then. We rarely took a Bootsy Thornton from junior college. Who was it? Walter Berry went to San Jack. That didn't happen very much with
Mo Hatton came from JUCO as well.
Well, that too, yeah. Marcus and Bootsy, but they were kind of tied at the hip because it's almost like wherever Bootsy went, Marcus was going to go, and it turned out that Marcus turned out to be as good a player. But I think you see my point. The talent spigot is closing some places, but opening other places. Yeah. And so I don't think they're going to have any problem getting players. So when I say Sweet 16, I'm thinking by year 2, kids are going to see the writing on the wall and say, hey, this is a good place to go to college. Madison Square Garden, a game in November or December, and it's 14,000 to see Michigan play St. John's. That's what we had in the old days. That's what Louis had. And that's the magic of walking down 33rd and 7th and smelling the chestnuts roasting, and going into the garden. So that's still very possible. And again, I think he's the right guy for it. I mean, I don't think there's a better guy they could have hired in that regard.
All right. You guys have seen Fran get in the mix a little bit the last few weeks. after St. John's versus UConn
Yeah, that was
on
fun.
December 23rd. I was in the building for that one. That was an amazing
Wow.
atmosphere,
Oh
amazing
man.
game. 4-point loss by St. John's. Fran, you found yourself in the middle of a war of words between UConn head coach Dan Hurley and Rick
Yeah.
Pitino. And for the fans and listeners who may not be familiar, I'm going to lay it out for you. So, Fran, just
Yeah.
bear with me here in a second. So, Pitino says after the game that he plans to play UConn at Carnesecca Arena next season. Now, whether that's to just get under Dan Hurley's skin or whatnot, Hurley was asked about the comment, and he said, "quote Everyone's trying to get what we have. We've won 4 national championships since 2000 here at UConn. They, meaning St. John's, haven't made much success since then, especially when they went from Fran to Mike Jarvis and they had those really good teams with Ron Artest."
Oh
So
boy.
Hurley continues and says they're trying to do what they need to do to build their program up. But anyone not named Duke, Carolina, Kansas, Kentucky, I'm probably going to miss a couple teams here. They're all going for what we have. We had unbelievable success here in basketball, and there are programs who haven't been to a Final Four in over 20 years. And obviously, there's a lot of punching up. Well, that comment by Hurley led to St. John's assistant coach, Steve Masiello, former Manhattan coach. So you guys are seeing all the little connections here between Fran and you heard Talik and Steve and Manhattan and Providence. We got a lot of things we're tying together here. So Steve Masiello chimes in and says on Twitter, I think Coach Pitino stopped punching up after his 5th Final Four, or was it his 6th Final Four? No, wait. I think it was his 7th Final Four. And so again, that happens, and here comes Fran, and he says, I think this is to screw with UConn and Dan, but then you pushed the envelope a little bit and said, if you know UConn fans, 2,000 of them are going to find their way into Carnesecca Arena. And that caught the eye of all us St. John's fans and season ticket holders.
Yeah.
But so did Rick Pitino take notice, who said, quote, easy, Fran. As an ex-Johnny's coach, I wouldn't bet on it. Fran, what is your take on the budding
Oh
rivalry
man.
between Rick Pitino and Dan Hurley? And how great is it that the Big East is once again being lifted up by the coaches, including Sean Miller, Shaka Smart, Ed Cooley, Greg McDermott, Thad Matta, and the aforementioned Hurley and Pitino?
Okay, so I get a chance to to answer. I can be snarky at times on Twitter. At times, not often, but I can be. Dan Hurley's a very good friend. Um, I love that they went back and forth. I love Coach Pitino tweaking them about playing in Carnesecca. Dan Hurley is like his dad. He ain't taking crap from anybody. Neither is Rick. Okay. Which I think is phenomenal for the Big East. That's how it was in the old days. That's the 30 for 30. That's even me and Calhoun and so on and so forth. I innocently thought to myself, holy crap, knowing UConn fans, they're going to figure out a way, StubHub, whatever, secondary market. And that would be an amazing atmosphere in there. Now, when I saw Rick tweet back at me, I smiled because I was like, first of all, he's paying attention to me. I don't even know if he follows me on Twitter. I don't even know. But then he snapped back, and I just thought it was great because I have no dog in this fight. Dan is a good friend. Coach Pitino, I respect immensely. Steve Masiello, very good friend. I've known Van Macon forever. But what it taught me and what it told me was this is what the Big East needs. This is the kind of vitriol, if you will, and I would say a healthy respect both ways. Okay, like when Coach Pitino after the press conference in Hartford said, "Yeah, we've played some good teams this year. They're decent, right?" I texted Danny Hurley and said, "Don't let him get under your skin," you know. But the bottom line is, this is all great for Big East basketball, and it
Right.
is. And I just think like if the Big East wants to maintain where it's been the last few years, now that they've got the UConn back in the fold, Patino there, Shaka Smart, it needs this kind of healthy respect, but a little vitriol does not hurt. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it, Dave.
Glad you were able to give your side of it. Brad, you call a lot of games for ESPN, obviously with the Big 12, but you have your pulse on the whole of college basketball. From the 30,000 foot view, How important is it for St. John's to be a contender in the Big East and in the sport in general?
Well, it goes back to, we've kind of weaved through this in this podcast, and the answer is it's very important. Um, because I remember when I was coaching at St. John's, and I can't say this right now, we would say we're one of the 6 winningest programs in college basketball history. Now that fell off, okay? But what it said to me when I was the coach was this incredible rich history that St. John's has, going back to, all the great coaches, Frank McGuire, certainly, and Coach Lapchick and Coach Carnesecca. And so the history of St. John's is right there at the top of college basketball. New York City, Madison Square Garden, the Big East, Dave Gavitt's baby, which turned into a more, a monster. All of those reasons. The fact that college football now overwhelms college basketball. All of these reasons are important why St. John's has to be relevant and good on the national stage, because it's where it is. It's New York. It's history. It's St. John's literally goes back to the beginning of the history of college basketball. College basketball took off in the 30s and 40s in New York City, the city game. So it's incredibly important. And that's why I think when all is said and done, this was a great hire.
Coach Fran Fraschilla, you said Sweet 16 for Rick Pitino in year 2, and we're going to end it with this one. St. John's is coming off of this win against Providence at Madison Square Garden. St. John's is 12-4 this season, 4-1, and tied for first place in the Big East. So you see the infancy, as you mentioned.
Yes.
You just say it's Sweet 16 year 2. What is the ceiling? What kind of a ceiling is there? Perhaps not just this year, because I think that may not be fair, but what's the realistic ceiling that for St. John's fan expectation under Rick Pitino, who's under contract for 6 years?
I think NCAA tournaments, and again, I don't want to put the jinx on him, Sweet 16 second year. I just think like it wouldn't, I mean, I don't want to put any more pressure on him. He doesn't care. But I think there'll be a perennial NCAA team, Sweet 16. If things fall right in recruiting, whether it's the transfer portal or the high school recruits, there's no reason why they're not selling out Madison Square Garden 4 to 5 times a year, and the other times it's 10, 12, 14,000 in there. And they're being, I would say, a top 3, top 4 team in the Big East. I say this all the time in the Big 12. Kelvin Sampson's going through this. He dominated the American Conference. This way Rick dominated, the MAC for a couple of years. They're going to get dinged, St. John's. They're going to go, even in a great year, 13-5 is a great year for Kansas. It's a great year for Duke in the ACC. So they're going to get dinged. But I think St. John's, if Rick stays the course through the 6 years, then I think they'll be top 3, top 4 in the Big East, which puts them in the top 20 every year, which puts them in the NCAA tournament every year. And when you have a coach who's been to, was it Steve Massiello said 7 Final Fours? I know my man Steve's not lying about that because he knows.
Yep.
Then I think like what's happened at all these places, Kentucky, Louisville, and Providence, even the years you don't expect to get to a Final Four, you get there because you have Rick Pitino as your coach. So, I mean, I think the bottom line, David, is the future is incredibly bright because you have a mix of all the things you need for a team to be really good: tradition, history, facility in terms of the Garden, and a Hall of Fame coach. I mean, what else can you ask for?
What else can you ask for? Coach Fran Fraschilla, you can see him all over ESPN calling games. Make sure you're following him on Twitter for some of that snarky tweets and see what else he has to say about Dan Hurley and Rick Pitino the rest of the season. Coach, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for taking some time with us.
It's a pleasure, Dave, and I meant that. You had some very good questions. You made me think, but I also am glad I was able to go back in history a little bit, praise some of those guys I coached, and also maybe clear up some things that behind the scenes people didn't know about. So all good. I told you I've had a great life so far, knock on wood, and I've never had any bitterness. I wish St. John's all the best. And who knows? I actually miss covering the Big East, which I did for 3 years at ESPN. But I'll be rooting for St. John's because I like the staff and I like the direction they're going.
And hopefully we see you back at Madison Square Garden or Carnesecca Arena one of these days. Johnny Nation, Coach Fran Fraschilla taking us down memory lane. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.